Resume recording. The idea behind the seminar, Bernie Sanders' campaign, has it changed politics in the US, was because for us as well in Britain, we had Jeremy Corbyn, which was his campaign was our big hope for a government that would break with neoliberalism and start shifting politics back to the left, start shifting wealth and power to the 99% away from the 1%. And obviously, the general election campaign was, and the outcome of that campaign was a huge deception. We've talked about that here in Britain, but it has left a legacy, which we have to defend. And so Bernie, from this side of the Atlantic, seemed to have done a fantastic campaign in the US as well in terms of setting a left agenda, putting an alternative politics. We might not agree on absolutely 100% of what he was arguing for, but certainly it was a breath of fresh air in terms of shifting politics back to the left and having a campaign, a real grassroots campaign. So the seminar tonight, or the meeting tonight, is to discuss principally what's happening in the US, whether Bernie's campaign has left a legacy, has it shifted politics. And we have three speakers tonight. We have Dan La Botz, who will kick off. He's co-editor of a website called New Politics, and I recommend you go there, New Politics. And then we have, sorry about that. We have Dan La Botz, who's co-editor of New Politics website and a member of the Brooklyn Democratic Socialist Alliance, as well as being a Labour activist and a co-founder of the Teamsters for a Democratic Union. Joanna Misnik, who's also in Solidarity, long-term activist, Chicago Democratic Socialist Alliance, and in Solidarity as well. And we have Larry Sanders, very pleased to have Larry here tonight, who's, as you can guess from his name, Bernie's brother, but he's an activist, he's a socialist, he's a member of the Green Party, and a spokesman on health for the Green Party. So the format tonight is the speakers will kick off for Dan and Joanna for 10, 12 minutes, and Larry will come in for 6 or 7 or something like that, and we'll open it up for Q&As and for contributions from the floor. So there you are. So welcome everybody, and Dan, it's up to you. Tell us how it's going over there.
Okay, at the moment, as you know, because of the coronavirus epidemic, it's not going too well. But we're going to talk today about Bernie Sanders. I want to say that I think the Bernie Sanders campaign was the most important political event in the United States since the 1960s and 70s. There has been nothing quite like it in terms of having an impact and transforming American politics. And Bernie Sanders himself became a figure in American society who might be compared to Martin Luther King. That is, we have not had such a political sense of political challenge and political ideas and a major political figure since that time period. And why was he so important? Number one, of course, for many of us, we thought it was wonderful that he said, we need to have a fight against the billionaire class. This is a country that never uses the word class. And so that was tremendously important. He said, we need a political revolution. Now, to introduce the word revolution, even if not anything near like what we have in mind by it, was also very important. And of course, he introduced the word socialism. So after having decades and decades and decades since the Red Scare, since McCarthyism and so on, when you could never talk about socialism, to have socialism come on the agenda and be a word that we could talk about in America and discuss, and to see many tens of thousands of young people adopt it is tremendous. All of those things were remarkable. But not just that alone. Bernie's political program within the Democratic Party was the most progressive political program in 50 years. There had been nothing as progressive since the Johnson years. Lyndon B. Johnson really introduced almost a second New Deal in those years, and certainly what was a New Deal in, for Black people, including Black people in the American New Deal. So for Bernie Sanders to raise his political program, most famously Medicare for all, free college tuition, raising minimum wages, and many other points, was quite remarkable. He built a political movement. Now, I think this is not the same as a social movement. It doesn't have the same characteristics, but it really had many of the characteristics of a movement. Tens of thousands of people came out to see Bernie Sanders speak in his rallies. More than a million, a couple million people regularly gave him small contributions. He changed American political fundraising, the idea of how you run a political campaign, by raising millions, more money than any other candidate, millions of dollars from ordinary people who would send him on the average $27. And the first time he said that, then everybody else sent $27. So it sort of became, this is, if you want to support Bernie, send $27. It was really, so there were aspects of a political movement here. And I think that's important. It led to his use of the word socialism. His creation of this campaign led to the growth of the Democratic Socialists of America. And the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, went from a membership of 5,000, mostly older, not very active people, to an organization of 60,000, mostly young, active people. Now, I can't say they're all activists, as some left groups have committed activists who are willing to work practically full-time beside their full-time job. But we have thousands of people in DSA who are very active in many different places. So he really also, and this many people point to this as perhaps his greatest contribution, I'm not sure, but it's certainly an important one, he changed America's political consciousness on so many questions. He took the ideas that had been raised in a more limited way by Occupy Wall Street, by that important movement of people coming out and saying, we're against economic inequality and we're against the role of money in politics. And he took those ideas and put them onto a political plane. In the United States, the only idea of politics is where you go to vote. And so he took those ideas and took them to the place that people understood to be American politics. I myself have run for political office. I know that on most days, if I go to somebody's house and knock on their door and I say, I want to talk to you about socialism, they say, get the hell out of here. But if I'm a political candidate and I say, I knock on your door and I want to talk to you, they say, oh yeah, what are you running for? What's your program? You got a piece of literature. I've had this experience. I know it's true. So having a political campaign allowed him to take the ideas of Occupy Wall Street, but not only Occupy Wall Street, because we had another huge movement of demonstrations of tens of thousands in all the cities of the country called Black Lives Matter that had a tremendous impact also on Black people. And that movement came along and it challenged Bernie. And Bernie took up the challenge and he modified his program. He learned from it. I think one of the most amazing things was to have a political candidate who had an actual living interaction with the social movements, such as Bernie does. We've had one other in the past, Jesse Jackson, when he campaigned for office in the 1980s, appeared at every picket line in the country. He appeared at the Mexican border with the Mexican socialist candidate for president, Rosario Ibarra, also a Fourth International person, and appeared with her on the border and spoke out against US policy. So Jesse Jackson was also a remarkable figure who had some of these qualities. But Bernie Sanders really did, as I say, all these remarkable changes, all these remarkable impacts. The idea of socialism, building DSA, adopting and taking up the issues of the movement, quite remarkable. And his slogans, fight the billionaire class and calling for a political revolution. We are all in America, whatever you felt about Bernie, left, right, or center, everyone has been changed by the fact that he did that. And of course, it was sort of the antidote to Trump. Trump was saying your enemies are Muslims, Mexicans, and Arabs, Muslims, Mexicans, and the media, I should say, and Muslims, Arabs, and the media. And Trump is saying, I'm going to protect you from these evil forces. And Bernie Sanders was saying, your problem is the billionaire class, the 1%, and I'm going to protect you from those evil forces, and I'm going to do it by offering a political program for the American working class. And he talked about the working class, something that almost never happens. Now, there are, how many minutes am I into here?
Oh, well, you've got another 5 minutes or so.
Well, that's good. I need another 5 minutes. I think there's real questions raised by his campaign, though. He was never the perfect candidate. A few candidates are perfect. A guy who, many people would have said Bernie could have had a much stronger set of policies in foreign policy, a much stronger set of positions on foreign policy. There's no doubt about that. He certainly is one of the best people in the US Congress on those issues, but he might have had stronger policies on US imperialism, opposition to US imperialism. But who else calls for containing the military budget or cutting the military budget and so on? So, but I think I think we have to say that the question is, one of the most important questions is, what is his relationship to the Democratic Party and what will be ours after this? That is, he ran as a Democratic Party candidate. Many of us, like myself, for whom it had been anathema to vote for the Republicans or the Democrats, who never would have considered it, decided to go out and work for and support and vote for Bernie. And how come? Because we felt he was going to make possible the building of a movement. I never had any illusions, I think many didn't, that we could reform the Democratic Party or take over the Democratic Party or something. But there is the question, how will what will happen to these people affected by the Bernie movement? Where is the Democratic Party going to go? Where are they going to go in the Democratic Party? There's also the question of what happens to the movements that Bernie helped to inspire, the Medicare for All movement, the movement of fighting for higher minimum wages, for $15 an hour, a living wage in the United States. What happens to the movement, well, for all of those things, for free college tuition in public colleges and universities and so on. Now, I think that there's a whole question raised here, several questions raised about the future. I don't have any predictions. My crystal ball is a little foggy this morning. And I think it's hard to look into that for several reasons. One is Trump is a very authoritarian president. He has raised ideas here that are quite threatening to American bourgeois democracy. We're not big fans. We would think there should be a lot more bourgeois democracy, but I'm for defending the democracy we have, bourgeois democracy, against a figure like Trump. And so the question is, what is Trump going to do? Trump's behavior, Trump's role. People have raised the question, if there's a resurgence of the coronavirus, could he cancel the November elections or postpone them and try to keep himself in office and so on? I think that's pretty far out. It's not necessarily, I'm not predicting that, but he's the kind of figure you have to wonder what the hell is up. But there's also the question of Joe Biden. Joe Biden, as you know, won the Democratic Party primary and caucus and is the presumed candidate. Joe Biden is a weak candidate. Many people criticize him. There are rape charges against him from one woman. There are many. He's a defender of the role of the whole neoliberal record of. Inevitably, he's the defender because he was the vice president of Clinton, of Obama, and so on. So he is a figure that's not very strong. Could the Democratic Party decide going into the convention, especially if he were to fall sick? He's an older man. If he were to become ill, or if the rape charges or something else were to make them feel they couldn't support him, could we end up having to have a different Democratic Party candidate? But what happens to the DSA members? What happens to those people who wanted Bernie? What should they do? I have no doubt that people should work to defeat Trump, that we should get rid of Trump, and that should be one of our central goals in the coming period. But it doesn't deal with all of our problems. It doesn't answer all of our questions. And so I think I probably used most of those 5 minutes, and I had to pass the baton to the next runner.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Right, great. Now, so I'll bring in. Thank you very much, Dan. If we were in a live meeting, we could have a round of applause. But there's a little sign at the bottom where you can have a little. There's a reaction sign at the bottom where you can applaud. I think so. The next person is Joanna. Joanna, I'll unmute you and go ahead, Joanna.
Well, I think I let Dan go first so he could put it all in broad sweep perspective. Bernie Sanders changed the complexion of American politics, and I hope for some time to come. And ironically, the outbreak of this pandemic and the fight for the government to first and foremost serve the needs and keep alive the average person, the person who's been unemployed, the person who doesn't have a job, the person who's being thrown out of their homes. The type of positions that Bernie is taking reflect to a very large degree the program he tried, the quintessential of what he tried to do with his program, which is this unequal world we live in, this society with this huge gap between the rich and the poor. We have to turn it all around and build a society for all of us. And now the definition of all of us in the midst of this pandemic and the economic upheaval that it's causing to most American workers has very much echoes of his program and much, much more. So I think that many of the Bernie supporters will be fighting for the type of relief, the type of aid that Bernie is proposing. We already see that in the streets with car caravans for rent, for people to be able to not pay their rent, for people to be let out of the prison so they can survive when there's a COVID-19 virus that's there. These are all these activities which are restricted because there is, after all, a stay-at-home order, are reflective of the values and the activism that Bernie instilled in the United States. It's a pro-Bernie movement seeking to find a way to remain active, to put pressure on the government and speak for working people instead of the billionaires. And it's headed by the program that he's trying to impose in Congress for money for the to relieve those folks. So there is that activity there that remains. But in general, Bernie Sanders did change the complexion of American politics. He brought in a socialism that, we would call very basic Denmark socialism, but it was something that the American worker hadn't heard of, or if they've heard of it, identified it with the Soviet Union and said, we're not having that. So through the use, and I think this was smart, I don't have any qualms about this. For 80, 90 years in the United States, left revolutionaries have said we need a third political party. Absolutely true. I'd even take a fourth. But we've made absolutely no motion forward to such a party, which would be anchored in the American working class. And as neoliberalism gets tougher and tougher, and as the American labor movement gets weaker and weaker, the idea that we just pronounce the need for such a thing and see that it happens is myopic and not very strategic. So what I think, Bernie took the use of the Democratic Party ballot line to speak to millions and millions of people that we could not reach with our small newspapers and the kind of fractured number of organizations that exist, both here and I believe in Britain as well. So that it was a unifier of certain basic values and certain assumptions that excited the working class and made many feel like, yeah, this ain't right. We can change things on behalf of the majority of people in this country. That's not going to go away, particularly with this pandemic, which is going to grind down the average working person, who hopefully we can utilize the momentum, what's left of the momentum of the Bernie campaign, to keep people active and demanding the right to survive, the right to recover, as we say in Chicago, the right to recover from the pandemic and from the economic whammy that it's given us. So I think that in a certain sense, we on the left, revolutionary left, were faced with, you'll notice I'm speaking of stuff other than what Dan covered. We are on the left we're faced with sort of a notion of what is the tactical approach that we take to this immensely important campaign. In much the same way, I think that revolutionary groups within Britain, when the Corbyn phenomenon continued to rise, had a similar, well, an analogous choice to make, which is we've been outside that stinking Labour Party for so long, maybe it's time to go back because something new is happening, a movement is happening through the Corbyn opposition. I think those were analogous choices that were made, and I think that each of our groups, I think, made the appropriate choice. So, but it is a tactic, and it does signify to a goodly extent that, we are on the verge of trying to build a new socialist movement that kind of realigns everything, that isn't in continuity with the first four, the first international, the second international, the third international, and the fourth international, that something new and of a beginning nature is happening, a radicalization, and we have to fully embrace it. And Bernie was the spokesperson for it in the United States. The other thing I think we learned is there has been discussion, and there will continue to be, is what does it mean to build a new political party in any country? And I think more and more we understand that because of the social movements that continue to arise everywhere around the world, to represent specific evils that have to be addressed, but must be united in terms of bringing the class together to fight for all of these solutions. A political party has to embrace both the social movements and the more standardized political movement as we understand it. And that, I think, is something that the Bernie movement put forward in the concrete. You had the eco-socialist movement, the Sunrise movement, the black elements of the black movement, elements of the working class movement in terms of the trade unions, the revolutionary socialists. You had an admixture of social movement and political movement, so to speak, ideological movements coming together to try to build a new permanent presence, if not a political party. To me, that's a start on what we need to do in the future. What the pandemic will do to all of this momentum is beyond me. I don't know. I mean, you hear stories that nobody can be immune today. The World Health Organization said, you can't be immune. We don't see any immunity in terms of people who've had the thing. So it's a question of restarting the economy and restarting the, rebuilding the working class. Even though there is a recession, we don't know to what degree that will be hampered. And that has an impact, a huge social impact. If this pandemic is going to disrupt production and disrupt employment and disrupt the ability for people to feed their families and live in a home for a huge amount of time, we have a problem. And that problem makes it more difficult to build a socialist movement. A new party is a hopeful element. It has to be based on hope and goals. And if this thing grinds too many people down, we're in a difficulty. Two more things on the DSA. Bernie created the DSA, and he's still creating it. But they're moving beyond Bernie. They're moving in a direction of trying to study Marxism, trying to study the history of previous socialist movements, to become more sophisticated in their understanding of capitalism. And I think Dan says, what's going to happen? I think the core, there's no more than 10%, 15% of this 56, 60,000 people are active on a day-to-day level. These are the real DSAers who think about program, who try to conduct activity. And I think they are not going to go away, because they're beyond Bernie. And that's the title of a book that several of very bright ones of them have written, Beyond Bernie. There's more to Bernie than just Bernie. We're going to keep moving. And what they have engaged in principally are struggles that reflect Bernie's program, whether it's rent control, against cop violence, all these struggles that were englobed in the Bernie movement. These comrades are looking for ways to continue or even to launch and to be in coalition with people in their cities. I think the next step for the DSA is something like the old SP, Socialist Party of the United States, which had, hundreds of cities where they had the mayor and they had the city council. We can't necessarily go national right now, but we can, as DSA, launch local coalitions that run for city council, that work together to meet the needs of the working class in this pandemic, that fight for all kinds of things the working class needs in concert with other organizations as a proto-political party on a municipal level. We've already kind of done that in Chicago, and we have elected 6 open socialists to the city council for the first time in 100 years. And they act as a bloc, and they speak as a bloc, and they are, in their minds and in ours, tribunes of the people. I think that if we work locally, face to face with workers, we can engage people more and bring them into a socialist fighting perspective. I think that's going to happen in the DSA. I do not see any demoralization. As a matter of fact, I don't even see any interest in who to vote for. I see that among old people from the old left. Everybody on the old left, like myself, is saying, what do we do? Do we vote for the Green Party, which is an independent party, or do we vote to dump Trump? And it's a big discussion, but there's hardly anybody under 40 discussing it. It's like, it's gone. We did the elections. And I think that's wrong, and I hope we can have a discussion with the DSA on this. But they're not as worried as we are about what to do about the elections. In my view, and I'll give it to you, we have to dump Trump. And if that means weaponizing our vote and using Biden to help do that, that's what we have to do. This man is extremely dangerous. He will become more dangerous. He's also deranged. There's nothing that says he can possibly be the president any longer of this country. There was an advertisement for a special on nativism around the world, the growth of the right wing, and they interviewed a guy in Berlin at a right wing rally for this new party there, and he was wearing a Trump hat. So the interviewer said, "What's that to say?" It's in German, and the kid said, "Make Germany hate again." That is what we're fighting. And we have to, in the States, in this election, produce a defeat for Donald Trump, to tell the people who are voting for him and the people who support his xenophobic ideas around the world that they're losing, we are winning.
Right.
If we don't do that, our terrain will be far less fertile. So I departed from, the Bernie thing, but Bernie created all these issues. Bernie created all of these political questions and created a new day for us to rethink our tactics, our strategy, and our future.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joanna. That's great and inspiring. Thank you very much. Clap round from the audience around here. Well, now we're going to hear from Larry, who I introduced earlier on, who is Larry Sanders, Bernie's brother, a socialist, a member of the Green Party in Britain, and a campaigner on health, a spokesperson for the Green Party on health. So, Larry, it's up to you now. I'll wave at you in 7 or so minutes. Yeah.
Thanks very much. It's hard to follow all that. You've stolen all my lines, which were Bernard's lines, really, I guess. And it's particularly encouraging to me because the last time I really had a lot of discussion with revolutionary left people was really a long time ago in the 70s and 80s, but I worked a lot with people from Trotskyist groups. And at that point, they didn't really like the kind of things that Bernard did. They thought he was he was already running for office, and then he became mayor of his city, and they thought he was really a waste of time. And I thought, of course, partly as a brother, but also as a politician, I thought he was not a waste of time. Because the great thing that Bernard does, and people say, oh, he's got great policies, but he, personally, as a politician, he's not really charismatic and so on. I think he's underestimated. What Bernard can do is talk to people of all sorts of people, and they think he's a good guy, and they think he's telling you what he thinks, and it's not that easy. I've also, Dan said about, I've run in a lot of elections also. I've been on a lot of doorsteps. I've been thrown off a few. So it's these things are not so easy. And I remember watching Bernard in '76 when he was running for governor. He got 6% in that election. I went to a meeting, ordinary, and this Republican Vermont. People don't remember this, don't know this. Vermont is one of the most Republican states in the country. And the governor was the guy who was going to be elected was a Republican. And Bernard talked to this audience, mostly Republicans, some Democrats, one or two of his Liberty Union type. And they clapped more for him than for the candidates. And it was something he just had this touch. And I think that capacity is of enormous importance. And I do worry a bit that if he inevitably reduces his participation over the years, I'm not sure about replacement, although Alexandria, of course, is an astonishingly good speaker and politician. I wanted to say something else, though, that is a little different from what people have been saying, because the more I think about it, the more I read, the more it's clear that all this careful building and how do we organize, all those great questions are likely to be swept away, because I think we're heading into an absolutely unpredictable maelstrom. But I was just really, and I should have thought of these things, but sometimes you don't. There are going to be billions of people in the global south who will starve. in the next months. All those people who worked were exploited, desperately exploited by the capital, but that was their source of income. That's drying up, and they don't have governments. I mean, we now know after all these years of our governments telling us they couldn't afford anything, there was no money. We now know that you can, what you can do. The money is there. It's all a political question. So we can protect if we do it well. Trump won't do it well, but we can protect people in rich countries, and similarly in Britain, where we have a very poor government. But nonetheless, the money, the wealth is there to maintain people if it's used at all wisely. That's not true of large parts of the world. That's going to have impacts. And then there's failures that these are very big issues. These questions of feeding hundreds of millions of people who don't have an income. The disruption of our economy, I don't think it can be exaggerated. And they will be done badly in countries like Britain and the United States because of very incompetent and stupid governments, in addition to their capitalist directions. I think that I think Joanna talked about that a bit. There are going to be rent battles as people get thrown out of their houses. There's going to be hunger. We talked about rows of cars lined up to get a couple of cartons of food. Wow. I mean, large numbers, huge numbers of people worried about having food to eat. We haven't had that for a while. I mean, we have had a lot of poverty, but at this level and extent, I don't think we've had it for a very long time. So I think we're not going to have time to sit around and talk about these very interesting questions of organization. The shit is hitting the fan, and we've got to do what we can.
Great, thanks, Larry. That's wonderful. I think bringing in that the personal qualities of Bernie is important, because it reminds me very much of Jeremy as well, who has got a great empathy for ordinary working people and can approach people in a way that is genuine and Tories could not do. And he really was seen, and he still is seen as one of us. And the other thing about the qualities of Bernie and Jeremy is that they've stayed the course for all these decades, and they've stayed the line and carried on the fight, arguing for socialism, arguing for a Green New Deal and new politics. Anyway, so I'll open up. I'll read a couple of questions, but if anybody wants to speak, then there's a function here to say, you raise your blue hand and I'll let you in. But there's a couple of questions here for the panelists. One from Liam, who asks, how do the comrades explain the apparently irrational self-destructive loyalty of Trump's demoralized working class base? Is it simply racism? And Imba asks, I'd like to hear something from the panelists about the use of charges of anti-Semitism in the effort to delegitimize Sanders and his campaign. So I don't know if anybody wants to come in on those two things. There was another question earlier on an email coming in about Palestine and Sanders and the Middle East. So if somebody wants to come in on that, right? Nobody's putting up their hands yet, so maybe I should chuck these questions. Right, actually, Valerie asks, can the panelists make it clear why Bernie backed down? So that's the third one. I'll just see if there's another fourth one in the chat. So, by the way, to people in the audience, it's easier for us to read it if they're in the Q&A function rather than the chat, right? So, a question, how do socialists, that's from Dave, how do socialists in the US make sure that Trump does not win again without hitching itself to the Democratic Party? Is it possible to have a tactical vote where you vote, say, Green in states which are definitely going to Trump or Biden, but vote against Trump in the swing states? There you are. A few questions back to the panel. Who wants to kick off there? Joanna, do you want to? I'll unmute all of you there so you can.
I think everybody might want to say something about.
Exactly.
On the question of. What was the first one?
The irrational self-destructive loyalty to Trump.
Yes. No, I can't do that, even though
I'll do that one when you're done.
I don't think I can do that. But what, it's just a frenzy. It's just a byproduct, I think, of neoliberalism. What are we seeing in Europe? We're seeing the same thing. And there's even a much stronger working class tradition. For us, it's a big working class tradition that remains, that resides in Europe. And yet we're getting these types of right-wing throwbacks as well. It's the income inequality and the feeling that, you know, you're getting completely immersed in bad stuff, and you need a strong leader who can take us back against these liberals. It's happening. It's white in our country. It's middle-class shopkeepers who surrounded the Lansing, Michigan Capitol with gun-toting people saying, "Open this damn place up. Somebody has to die, so just open it up." It's frenzy and it's fear, and it's comparable in many ways to Germany in a certain period, which is why I think Trump is so dangerous. The second thing is there is discussion. I'm an advocate of, as I said, we must defeat Trump. That's the number one thing to preserve a working class that can take steps forward in its own interests. If we don't, we're pushed much farther back. Thus, I believe we do need to vote for we're not endorsing the Democratic Party. We are not endorsing Joe Biden or anybody else they put up. And we are not joining the Democratic Party. We are using our franchise this time around to stop a very evil guy and his minions who are in the White House, who will harm even further the working class and democratic rights in the United States. That's what we're doing. Now, if people feel so uncomfortable that they have to say, well, I'm in a Democratic Party state, so I'm going to vote for the Green Party, I don't advocate that. I advocate that everybody stick together with this strategy and embrace it as a strategy of the movement.
Right, Dan?
Yes, let me just say a word on this first question about why do they stick with Trump. 40% stick with Trump, which is pretty remarkable. We have to remember a lot of those are wealthy people. That is, these are upper class, upper middle class Republicans. They have money, they like him, and there are so many Republicans support him because of the tax break, trillions of dollars in tax breaks. They'd put up with anything else to get their money. It's about money. There's a large section of the middle class that supports him, and I think there's a layer of the working class that supports him. The reason for that has to do with the fact that many white working class people felt abandoned, absolutely were abandoned by both their labor union leaders and the Democratic Party. And so many of those workers then turned somewhere else. They'd already been voting Republican for years, men, especially men, white men. So what holds that? I think there's other elements though. People that is the whole movement to people have the right to carry guns, the anti-abortion movement. Evangelical Christians play an important role in this, and anti-LGBTQ thing. So all of that is kind of a right-wing glue, but holding it together is racism. And I believe the racism in the American society and even in the American working class has been profound for generations. It has changed somewhat, I think, even in the last couple of decades, as the country became more diverse. People were in different kinds of jobs than they'd been before, but nonetheless, those are very important challenges. Bernie did not back down, he lost. Bernie lost because the Democratic Party establishment all rallied together to support Joe Biden. And first, the South Carolina vote, they all came together, every other candidate, every old Democrat they could find, anybody who would come forward to endorse him. So I think that's the reason and Bernie said, I'm not dropping off out of the race. I want to have as many delegates as possible there. He didn't, I don't think he backed down. I don't think he gave up. He said, I'm going to continue to fight for my ideas. I want my delegates there. Having delegates there, you can't really do it. You know, the Democratic Party platform is a worthless piece of paper. Nobody pays attention to it, but it might be important there to keep his supporters together, to rally them around his ideas, to have them leave to go continue to fight for a movement. I differ with Joanna Misnik, I think, on this question of, I am for voting against Trump. I'm making the fight against Trump, but I do think in states where it doesn't matter, will have no effect, it is worthwhile to keep the Green Party on the ballot in New York, where we have a great candidate, Solidarity member, Howie Hawkins, a person who has a proven ability to win a lot of votes, enough votes to keep his ballot line. You have to get so many votes here to stay on the ballot line. And we ought not to let him go down. We ought to protect him and other Green candidates in some places. I agree with the general message Joanna has here about dumping Trump. I think that's probably enough to say right now.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much. And Larry, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, yes, I would like to say about the Trump supporters. First of all, they're not new. Maybe 40% is more, but in my whole growing up, we all remember Joe McCarthy. And Dan is right. Probably the majority of his supporters are old-fashioned Republicans, i.e., slightly lower middle class, slightly affluent, plus a small number of very rich people, which fortunately, unfortunately, there aren't that many of them. And I think that there is a bitterness there that comes from all sorts of places, and it emerges in saying, I'd rather do without myself than see somebody else, especially a black person or somebody I look down on, get that benefit. So there is something very, and it ties in tightly with racism, of course. So there is a bitterness, and it infects parts of the working class like it infects parts of every part of American society, and sadly, not only American society.
Great. I see there's some more questions coming in, but there's somebody's put their blue hand up on the list, so I'll take them. It's Anders. So you've got a couple of minutes, but if other people want to speak, just find the function for raising your blue hand. So I'll allow James Hadfield after that. So I'll take James after Anders. Anders, you can unmute. I'm unmuting Anders now. Go ahead, Anders.
Okay, just a quick question. I saw none of the panelists mentioned the electoral system, and seen from Norway, it seems that this is a very great obstacle for forming a third party. And I mean, to make it a brief point, I mean, Hillary actually won the public vote in the US. So why should it be possible to build a broad alliance to change the system, the electoral system? When should both the US and the UK left raise this sort of long-term issue of the electoral system?
Okay, Anders, that's the question about the states. But before I take James, maybe I could answer on Britain. I mean, there was a referendum in Britain for proportional representation and a form of representation. It wasn't ideal. Much of the left voted against any reform of the electoral system here, while Socialist Resistance and some others were in favour of it. It was a very minimal move away from the first past the ballot. And we do think that reform is necessary. The outcome of the general election here in Britain shows that even though Labour won abysmally in terms of number of seats, it did have the best share of the vote, a better share of the vote, and a better total number of votes than the previous three general elections. Sorry, the one in 2015 and the 2010 which were not under Jeremy Corbyn. But now I'll take James. James, do you want to talk, James? Put your question. I'll unmute you now. Not quite unmuted. I'll unmute you again. Right, go ahead, James.
Yes, I think socialism is obviously the correct term, but as we are connected to planet Earth, I think we need to put the eco in front of the socialism, like the commons. So things like degrowth.info and eco-socialist horizons has to be an ecological form of socialism, or the planet won't survive.
Okay, that's important. Yeah, I mean, Jeremy and Bernie were arguing for a Green New Deal. Maybe that's something the panelists can answer. There's a couple of other questions up on the list here, which I'll read out. Well, one on which I mentioned earlier on, which is about was anti-Semitism used against Bernie, like it was used here in Britain, the fake accusations of anti-Semitism against Jeremy. Ron from Bristol, Ronald Mandel from Bristol asks, what is the future of the Sanders movement beyond the presidential election? Paul Prescott asks, in many US cities and states, there is already talk of austerity coming as a result of the virus. I see an opportunity to use the Bernie network to form broad anti-austerity coalitions. Do you see a similar dynamic happening in the UK? Well, that'll be, we'll have to deal with that, the UK again in another meeting. Warren Davis has got a long question here. Others see Trump as declaring the election fraudulent if he loses. There is a real possibility of a constitutional collapse. Biden is not seen as a viable antidote to this. Are you all as alarmed as many of us are? That's actually somebody from Philadelphia in the States. Right, so here's a few questions. So I'll throw it back to the panelists. Yeah, who wants to kick off there? Dan, do you want to start off, and then I'll take Larry and Joanna?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Yes, I agree very much with the James Hadfield, I think it was, who raised the question of that we should all be eco-socialists. Absolutely. We know that this coronavirus is caused in part by issues of industrial agriculture, the effects of the climate, and so on. That is, we have to have a very global, very comprehensive understanding that we are fighting against a capitalist system that is also destroying the planet. It is a huge, huge problem, obviously, because of the enormous weight of the fossil fuel industry, the great corporations like Exxon and so on around the world, and countries, entire countries that are like Saudi Arabia, which play such an enormous role in this question. So it is, and we definitely need something like a New Deal for a Green New Deal. But of course, the question of a Green New Deal is we should be for that, but how do we give it a social character? How do we give it a socialist character if we can? The way things often work in the United States is they say, we're going to have a big infrastructure project. We're going to give a lot of money to a bunch of big construction companies. That means a lot of highly skilled white workers get good jobs, and a lot of black men and women stand holding flags and so on. I think it's very important that we give any Green New Deal of a social character, as some of the people like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others who have raised this have talked about. That is, we have to talk about this providing jobs, and we want to, if such a thing starts, we want to see union organizing campaigns to unionize those workers. We want a race and gender equality in any Green New Deal. So we have to be raising as socialists those kinds of things and fight the American tendency that everything becomes profits, corporations, individualism, and so on. On the question of fighting austerity, I agree. Paul Prescott, I think, raised that. That's absolutely true. We have to do that. And it's a good, it's already taking place. It makes sense to be fighting austerity already because the business is closed. Now there's no taxes coming in. So therefore, city governments and state governments and county governments are saying, we have to lay off workers. And this will put more people, fewer taxes, but businesses will continue to collapse. So we have to fight that austerity. Paul is right. And that's part of the movement that Joanna described earlier, which she said, the DSA members, you have to build something like a proto-political party. You have to build, you have to work with rank and file movements in labor. Labor union officials are largely worthless in the United States, in my view, and we have to work with rank and file workers to transform those unions. They have to become fighting organizations for the working class. This was a slogan we had in the 70s. We have to revive that and revive that approach. And we have to link that to the social movements, movements against racism, movements against sexism, movements against ageism, I can say as well. Now that I'm so aged, I want to throw that in there. And so I think we have to link these things to the social movements. And finally, just on Anders Eklund's remark about the political system, it is a gigantic problem. In the United States, we have the first past the post system. We have two political parties. Anytime you try to organize a third party, you immediately help the Republicans. And so, and you have to say, how could you change that? I believe, now then there's the argument, well, it has to come from social upheaval. I wrote about this, actually an article I wrote for New Politics about your British situation. But I said, if you don't have a big social movement, it's hard to imagine creating some new political party. Of course, in the past, when we had big social movements, the Democratic Party succeeded in co-opting them. But Anders is right. We have a terribly bad political system here. We have to find a way to try to transform it, proportional representation, different kinds of, and also the bad political system. We now have a lot of attempts to get rid of black voters, older voters, student voters, anybody who would vote on the left, taking them off the rolls, all kinds of excuses used by the Republican Party, who are taking many Democratic Party people off the rolls.
Great, thank you. So, Larry, do you want to come in on anything?
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of points. The austerity thing is going to be desperately difficult at the local level, because it really is true that local authorities don't have money,
Right.
other than they raised in taxes, and it's going to be hard to raise taxes and all of that. But I think it's very important for us to know that on the national level, there is no real constraint on the government. There's a whole business that there's no money is just rubbish. They can, everything is complicated, you have to think, but you can create money. Governments, that's what governments are for. One of their main functions, create money to do the things that need to be done. So, what's to be done is a political question. Dan, of course, is right. Most of the time they use the money to give it away to their friends. But it's not necessary. We can use the money for other things. And I think we have to fight that, because most people think that the government is sort of like a household. And if you fall into debt, you've got a problem. Well, you do if you're a household, but you don't if you're a national government. And the Green New Deal, in my opinion, is, well, most versions of it are socialist in effect, because in two major ways. Bernard's very clearly says that the new energy is to be created and sold by government agencies. That will transform a huge chunk of American and any other country's economy. And the second bit is about transition, that people are going to lose jobs because of this movement. Coal miners are not needed. Oil workers are not needed. They have to go, but it's not their fault and they shouldn't suffer. So this whole business of destroying parts of the country because of changes in the economy, necessary changes often, is wrong. But you don't do it by stopping the change. The change has to happen, but those people need to be fully protected. In my opinion, those two things are very powerful socialist tools.
Great. We've got somebody called Lars who wants to come in. I'll allow him to talk and I'll unmute him now. I'm trying to do that. Yeah, Lars, go ahead, Lars.
Hi, Lars from Sweden here. 4 years ago, I was in the US visiting labor notes and Labor for Bernie. And I spoke to one of the leaders of Labor for Bernie, and he said, half jokingly, that, well, the left doesn't deserve Bernie, meaning that correctly, there hasn't been any social movements corresponding to the public and electoral appearance of an outspoken socialist in the US. Of course, there were special circumstances that made this possible. And my question, I have two questions. First is, how, and if anyway, is the campaign has been transforming into organizations? Joanna talked about it was Bernie that built the DSA. That's good, but what's happened to the campaign organizations like Our Revolution or Labor for Bernie? Is it just like the old saying says that democratic parties where the social movements go to die, or is something independent coming out of these campaign organizations? My second question is, why do you think Bernie was not able to win a substantial amount of African-American votes? And how was Biden sold to them and by whom? Thanks.
Great. Well, as there's nobody else coming in now, I'll take the panelists to come back on these two questions, yeah? Let me see, I've just got to unmute. Who wants to kick off? Joanna, do you want to come in?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, go on, Joanna.
I think that people ask, well, why did Bernie drop out?
Yeah.
I'm not clear on that. Some people say, well, Obama talked him into it. Other people, I think he had a deep concern about defeating Trump. I think that does rule him, and that does define his strategy, and that's why he decided he couldn't become the nominee. It was, things were against him, so he had to fold. But the issue is, what did he do with his apparatus? There's been a lot of discussion on this, and maybe you know, brother knows, but there was a gigantic, millions of people who were volunteers who didn't belong to any particular organization, weren't being paid, plus all of the supporting organizations were suddenly adrift to decide, you know, what they were going to do, because he did dismember that apparatus. I'm not so concerned about the professional staff he had, but that coalescence of large numbers of people who came together in his campaign and the organizations are now adrift. And I think that might have been an error in terms of continuing to fight, especially within the congressional arena, for his 6-point program to face the pandemic, which is a continuation of his thing. So that's a mistake. There's still some bewilderment about that, but I do think it's because he really meant it when he said Trump was the most dangerous person and he had to be defeated, and it's going to be Biden. There's nothing I could do. There's no way I can catch him. On the question of the black vote, it's been a while. The civil, we used to say that the black movement in the United States when we were younger, it was the vanguard of the working class because of the civil rights movement and the other really fierce mobilizations that they set up for their liberation, and the changes that it wrought in terms of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, getting into the working class in better ways. Neoliberalism has ebbed much of that away. You have a fallback in the black community. You have whole sections of the black community that are suffering the worst effects of neoliberalism, who are jobless, who have no steady income, and living in the center cities in some bad conditions. And that has sort of ebbed the power that the black movement had felt at one point. And I think, yes, they're holding on to the Democratic Party because it's not as bad as the Republican Party. It's a lesser evil vote of mass proportions. The only way we saw it shaken was the younger black voters were in fact attracted to Bernie in significant numbers. The problem is they didn't go to the folks who of that young age never made it to the polls. But the enthusiasm, there was only 20% vote from that age range, young age range. But that enthusiasm for Bernie was a breakthrough for a new kind of revitalization of African-American political thinking and strategy. But it is true, it's a defensive vote. And it remains a defensive vote. And they were afraid, I think, they were fearful that Bernie could not win. And you had to get rid of Trump, who was a monster, a racist monster. And then you had Obama, who not very obliquely was kind of saying that sort of thing, kind of using his energy and his people who support him, especially black elected officials in the South, to kind of say, well, we have to win, Biden's our man, et cetera. And it is an amazing thing to see folks endorsing people like Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Biden, who are the authors of deeply, deeply hurtful legislation and policy for the black community. It shows you how far the fear went.
Dan, I'll unmute you. Oops, sorry.
To both of those issues very well. I fundamentally agree with her. I think the question of, some of the people who supported Bernie, some of them are more oriented toward professional politics, I would say. And that's one part of that. And that group will go off, it'll take care of itself. And as Joanna said, the other question is what happens to all the hundreds of thousands of people who were enthused and tens of thousands of whom volunteered. And I think that DSA and other, some of the other groups are trying to preserve that, keep those networks alive and build something. I agree also on the black vote question. Black people voted pragmatically. They voted defensively. They voted to save themselves. But I would add one thing to what Joanna said is that for many decades, the Democratic Party cultivated a black political machine as elected officials, church leaders, heads of black NGOs. They received, and if you got along with the Democratic Party, they would help you get money for your NGO, money for your church, money for your political campaign. So the Democratic Party's black political organization was also very important to controlling the older black voters. Younger black voters, like younger people everywhere, tend to be less connected, to be freer, to think things out, freer to make their own decisions, and they did so. And it's great that Bernie won them, and I think that is an important change, as she said.
Larry, do you want to say anything for a few minutes?
I'll pass this one.
Sorry, not right now.
I'll pass on this one.
Okay, you'll pass on that one. A couple of more questions here from the audience. Josh asked, if the greatest need is to beat Trump, as has been argued, would they have endorsed Biden in the primary if they thought he had a greater chance of beating Trump? That also relates to a message or a question from Ian Parker, who asked, how strong a message and line can we send, and how do we articulate our disappointment that Bernie endorsed Biden, which in his opinion, that is in Parker's opinion, was shameful. And also question to Larry from Ian Drummond, is there any chance Bernie can run again in 2024? Or if the election is postponed because of COVID, and encourage him through you to go for it if health allows. And he concludes his remarks in the chat by saying, the last Prime Minister of Malaysia was elected at the age of 93. There was one question earlier on about anti-Semitism, and that
we didn't get to that.
Relates to a question about Palestine and so on, foreign policies. I mean, just one thing about I'd like to mention, which foreign policy, which was distinctive about Jeremy Corbyn, is when he first got elected as leader of the Labour Party, he clearly said that if he were elected Prime Minister, he would never press a nuclear button. And he stood firm on that, which was great. So anyway, yeah, Dan, do you want to say something?
Well, or Joanna might want to go first. I'll go. On the question of anti-Semitism, I am not aware that in any part of the big American public anti-Semitism was an issue. That is, it may have been raised in in the dark zones of the web. I did not see it anywhere. Anti-Semitism exists in sectors of American society, not as strongly as it did back before the 1960s. But I'm not aware of it. I wondered if Joanna is.
Okay,
No.
Joanna, right? Do you want to carry on, or shall I take Joanna?
I think we could both be in there for a minute if it doesn't bother you.
Carry on.
I'll carry on for one other thing. The question about be better to support Biden, or did Bernie just throw in the towel and so on. People have to understand that Bernie made such an impact because he ran as a Democrat. Many people said Bernie should have run an independent party. If Bernie had run an independent party, I could see he might have gotten something like the European Trotskyists used to get in the old days, 6% of the vote or something like that. Bernie Sanders would have been a very marginal candidate, even with his great, I think he is charismatic, by the way, Larry, in a weird way. But with his weird charisma, I think he would have still had a following. He would have had an impact, his position, but he would have been a marginal because of the way the system works and because of the way the powers work here. So he had to run into the Democratic Party. So to get in the Democratic Party, he had to sign the contract. And the contract is, if you want to run in the Democratic Party, you got to promise, I will support the candidate of the party. And he's a man, Bernie Sanders, I don't agree with him on everything, but he's certainly a person of great personal integrity. He says what he believes, he does what he says, and he sticks to his positions. And so I think that, and also I agree with Joanna, and also he wants to defeat Trump. So Bernie Sanders was from the beginning going to do that. And if there had been, I don't see it as throwing in the towel. He carried out his commitment to support the party's candidate. And that's who he is. That's how I see it.
Okay, before Joanna, maybe I should take Larry, who will answer about the future of Bernie in 2024. Let me unmute you, Larry. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think he will run. He says he won't run again. He will be 83, I think, in 2024, which is younger than me, so obviously he could do the job. but that's what he's saying at the moment, that he wouldn't think of running again. And almost on a personal level, I hope he won't, because he worked so hard at it. The anti-Semitism thing was tried, and it was very painful and disagreeable. I think Bernard didn't like it. You know, he's used to attacks, but he didn't like that particularly. Some of it came from Jewish people who thought he wasn't the right kind of Jew, which I didn't like. But it didn't catch on. It became a very powerful thing, anti-Corbyn issue here, but I don't think it ever took off in America, really.
Great. Okay, let me take Joanna. Joanna, you can go ahead now. Sorry, no. Sorry, I'll try and unmute you again. Go. Yeah, Joanna, you can go ahead now.
I think it's on the Bernie apparatus, for one thing. I hope we can encourage Bernie after. First of all, I don't know what kind of an election we're going to have. I agree with Warren that there are some issues that may block an actual election. The main one being that it has to be a mail-in vote. And as I indicated in my article, that's a situation where every state can decide whether they want to do that or whether they want to force people to stand in line and get a deadly disease. And in the Republican sphere, it is possible they won't want the mail-in ballot. And the other problem with that is the post office, which is the prize of the century for privatization in the United States, claims that it's going to be out of money by probably July or September. And yet these are the folks who would have to conduct that mail-in ballot state by state. And Trump says he's not going to give them any relief money unless they raise the cost of the postage stamp, which really one doesn't equal the other, trust me. It's just a barrier he's raising to say you're not going to get any money because this is something they've been trying to privatize for some time. It is 630,000 American workers, I think the plurality of whom are African American, who entered the middle class, the working class, and on the upper levels through this public employment years and years ago. It's really tottering, and they're doing every trick to get rid of it, which would mean the post office may be deemed incapable of handling this state by state. They won't give any money for it. The third issue is the question of states going bankrupt, which has been raised. Another thing they might try to stop the election. Mitch McConnell, the speaker of the whoever he is, said, if you can't afford stuff, just go bankrupt. Whereas in 2008, there was a law in that recession that you could not go bankrupt. Only cities could go bankrupt. That's a signal that they're not going to bail out the states. That would make it more difficult for the states to function, including conducting an election. So all of this is, plus you don't know how bad the pandemic is going to be. It raises a lot of issues about whether the election will actually take place and under what conditions. On the question of the Electoral College, it's kind of, I still think of it as a cart horse thing. Until there's a third political party with some clout that can actually help reform the electoral system in the United States by its existence and then whatever else it demands, I don't think we're going to be able to do much about that. First past the post, we've challenged in some places, in some states, but that's about what has been done. I think that's all I needed to say.
Great, thank you very much. We've got one person who's indicated to speak, and what I suggest is after that, there's no more questions and the chat is getting slower now. So I would suggest I would take David to speak, and then if Joanna, Larry, or Dan want to conclude by 1 or 2 minutes, then that's fine, and then we can wrap up the meeting. So I'll allow David, sorry, no, not James, sorry, David to speak. Am I doing it? Unmute. Trying to do it there, David, sorry. Go on. Yeah, I think David. No.
Yeah.
My
question was about slightly different about the Middle East. Bernie Sanders was one of my heroes as far as recognizing the importance of Palestine and the dignity of Palestinians. And I'm wondering whether this impact will continue to reverberate inside the Democratic Party, perhaps other places, or is it going to disappear as just a little ripple?
Okay. Well, look, thanks for that question. And in the concluding remarks, if the three speakers would like to address that question and say anything else they would like to say to the audience about the future of politics in the US, of socialist politics and the hopes that we have there, that would be great. And I'll make a few remarks after that, very briefly, about our next meeting. So, Larry, do you want to say anything now? I'll unmute you. Go on, yeah.
Very briefly. Am I muted?
Yeah, you're okay. Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to mention something that impressed me very well in Bernard's, which you raised more towards the end of the campaign, talking from a moral point of view. It often is that on the left, you're either very objective and all these objective forces are going to create what they're going to create, or you're moralistic and you say, well, we really ought to do this because it's better. And Bernard raised the class issue very clearly, but he also went on to say, I want you to think about fighting for somebody who isn't yourself. And I thought putting the two things together was so right and so powerful that I was really full of unusual, even greater admiration than usual for him. And I thought that that is something that the left ought to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks a lot, Larry. Joanna, do you want to come in now? I'll unmute you and then I'll take Dan. Go ahead, Joanna. No, I'll unmute you again. No, what's happening there?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Thanks for having this discussion. I think we're tardy in having it in the United States, and we should do something about that. But I want to just respond to the fellow who said, the words endorse and Biden should never be linked together. It's not going to happen. It isn't that. It is, I think, our job morally, as well as, steely strategy, to get rid of Trump if we possibly can, dump Trump. And that is what I insist that we use what franchise we have to pull a lever for this other guy. He could be anybody. He could be Cuomo. He could be clown so-and-so. We have to get rid of Trump. And there's just no more lamenting that we have to vote for a Democrat, because we're not voting for him. We're using his existence to get rid of Trump. And then we'll continue with our struggle.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joanna. And Dan, let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Thank you. On the Palestine.
Oh, sorry, I've muted you. Go ahead now. Yeah. Okay.
On the issue of Palestine, I think it's important that people understand that in the United States, I don't know, 80% of Americans don't know or think about foreign policy. It is not on their agenda. And I would say in the working class, the numbers may be higher than in the society at large. It's not part of, with the exception of those workers who are immigrants who are attached to their own countries and follow foreign policy in their country or region. It is a very good thing that, as you said, Bernie Sanders began to deal with the question of Palestine and give Palestinians the dignity and respect that they deserve in such a discussion, and to counter the U.S. Policy of more or less an open checkbook for Israel and unquestioned support for Israel. It's also important to note that many American Jews have, especially young American Jews, have become more critical of Israel and of Zionism and more independent. I live in Brooklyn. I am surrounded by Hasidim Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, Reform Jews, liberal Jews, but I go occasionally to Grand Army Plaza, half an hour walk from my house, and I find young Jewish kids, not right now during the virus, but found young Jewish kids demonstrating support with Palestine. So that's a very important development. I'm glad to see that. Palestine is not on the radar of most Americans. They don't know where it is, what it is, or why it's an issue. But it's good that somebody is taking it up. I wanted to say, finally, I agreed very much with what Larry said earlier about the severity of this health crisis and economic crisis in which we find ourselves. It is catastrophic. I think it is the most important event in American history, period. Including the Civil War, the 2 world wars, the Great Depression. This is going to be greater than those, I believe. The economic catastrophe, or 26.5 million unemployed people. 1 million cases we know about, 50,000 dead, and that's going to double or quadruple. And if there's a second wave of this, it's going to be worse. It is not at all clear to me how we can reconstruct normal economic, social, political functioning, or what that will look like afterwards. So it is going to be a tremendous fight, and not just a fight, it's going to be a tremendous job to think about this and to reorient ourselves and to find both our political and our moral compass. I'm glad that Larry brings up that dimension. I think that's very important. We want to fight this because this system is inevitably going to drive us to some terrible planetary and economic and social collapse. We want to fight it because it's wrong and it's not good for human beings, and we should love and take care of each other.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, I just want to thank all the panelists and Joanna, Dan and Larry for spending time with us to explain what's going on. There's many things which are important for us to discuss, and there are similarities in terms of the struggle we're facing for shifting politics to the left, beating the right wing, beating the hard right and the far right, which we've seen raise its head here over the last 2-3 years, not just in Britain, but across Europe as well. So thank you very much again. Thank you very much for all the people who attended and stayed all the course for this hour and 20 minutes. I just want to make some brief announcements.